I want to thank you for the opportunity to be with you here today. I'm always honored to be at my alma mater, even if virtually. And today's brought back memories to me of my own experience with MLK days when I was an undergrad. And so I'm grateful for the opportunity to relive those good memories and to be a part of MLK Day this day here. And I have to admit, I really love the theme for this year's MLK Day, realizing the dream through healing and resilience. I think it's so relevant to the fatigue that we all can be feeling, to the fragmentation, to the division in our society and culture, and to all the ways we can find healing and resilience as we continue in this work of justice. But also because I think it deconstructs the division we often make between activism on one hand and contemplation or reflection on the other, that we often separate the two from each other, as one is sort of interior and one is sort of exterior, when in fact the work of justice, when it is rooted in faith and love, I don't think is interested in making that distinction at all. And Martin Luther King Jr. gives us, actually embodies, I think, a spirituality that integrated reflection and action in so many interesting ways. And so I was really struck by the quote that is a part of the theme, where Dr. King wrote, "As my sufferings mounted, I soon realized that there were two ways in which I could respond to my situation, either to react with bitterness or to seek to transform the suffering into a creative force. I decided to follow the latter course." And as poignant and as relevant as those words from Dr. King are, it does leave us with the question, how do we transform suffering into a creative force? How do we do that? What is its source to be able to do that? And to answer that, I want to start by diving into just a little slice of history of the civil rights movement. And that little sliver is from the time when civil rights leaders like Dr. King and Ralph Abernathy and others often cited two particular books that they said were in their back pocket as they went about their long and difficult work. Two books that they often went back to time and time again. The first of those books is Jesus and the Disinherited by Howard Thurman. And Dr. Thurman's book reinterprets the life of Jesus in light of the experience of people who he said stood with their backs against the wall. Dr. Thurman happened to be one of the campus pastors at Boston University when Dr. King was doing his doctorate there, and Dr. Thurman became a mentor to Dr. King, not only during that time in Boston, but for the rest of his life. And the second book that was in their back pocket is this book, The Prophets, by Rabbi Abraham Heschel. And Heschel's book is a reinterpretation of the Hebrew prophets, the prophets of the Old Testament, in light of what they could tell us about what it means to be a prophet, a proclaimer of justice today. Now, the interesting thing, by the way, I commend both books to you. They're still in print. They still are amazing, relevant reads and worth reading today. But the interesting thing about both Dr. Thurman and Rabbi Heschel is that neither of them were by nature activists. They were both by nature mystics. They were both drawn to the inner life of contemplation and reflection, and yet their inner life of contemplation is what compelled them back out into their active life of service in the world, and the reason why they wrote the books the way that they did. So much so that when Dr. King and others were organizing the historic 1965 march from Selma to Montgomery, they invited Rabbi Heschel to join them. He accepted their invitation. And they walked arm in arm, Dr. Heschel and Dr. King, Rabbi Heschel and Dr. King, from Selma to Montgomery, those 4 days in March in 1965. And as a matter of fact, in this photo, that is him standing to the right of Dr. King in the white beard and the white hair. That's Rabbi Heschel. And he later wrote about the experience of that march in his diary. This is just an excerpt of what he wrote. I felt a sense of the holy in what I was doing. For many of us, the march from Selma to Montgomery was about protest and prayer. Legs are not lips, and walking is not kneeling, and yet our legs uttered songs. Even without words, our march was worship. I felt my legs were praying. That last line caught my breath when I first read it, because it reminded me, I felt my legs were praying. It reminded me of my own experience with the spiritual practice of walking the labyrinth. So just what is the spiritual practice of walking the labyrinth? Its origins come to us in the ancient Greek myth of the architect Daedalus building a labyrinth, a maze, as a prison to hold the bull-headed monster called the Minotaur. And that's its mythic origins. But its actual physical origins as a structure come to us through medieval churches in Europe, primarily in France, but in other places as well, that started to build actual structures of labyrinths in the floors of their sanctuaries as a map, as a kind of being able to do a pilgrimage in place without having to go anywhere. You would just walk the labyrinth inside the church. But these labyrinths are not mazes in the way we typically think of mazes. Mazes like the kind of maze you would have drawn a line through as a little kid that had all sorts of false starts and dead ends, and you had to go back and start over again. These labyrinths look like a maze when you look at them, but as long as you follow the path, it always leads to the center. There are no false starts. There are no dead ends. You don't ever have to start over. And this is what I think makes the labyrinth a profound place of prayer and contemplation, because you can always trust the path to lead you to the center. It will never lead you astray. The most famous of the medieval church labyrinths is at the massive cathedral, the Chartres Cathedral in France. And you see the cathedral there on the left and two photos of the labyrinth as inside its sanctuary on the right. But now you can find them all over the place. There was kind of a resurgence in popularity of labyrinths in the 20th century. And so now you can find them not only in churches and synagogues and faith communities, but in parks and retreat centers and hospitals and all sorts of places all over the world. But what brought me to the labyrinth is that the fact that when my wife Jenny and I moved back to St. Louis in 2008, I was walking around our neighborhood and I happened to discover a labyrinth in the churchyard 2 blocks from our house. And this is that labyrinth in the photo here. If you look in the background, that building is a restaurant, and our house is literally like a block and a half behind that building. And so in the spring of 2011, I walked the labyrinth every day as my spiritual discipline that year for the 40 days of Lent that lead to Easter. So every day for 40 days during Lent, I would walk the labyrinth. And then I kept a journal of my experience walking the labyrinth. So every day I would walk the labyrinth, every day I would write about it. And I started doing research as a part of this whole thing. And at the end of those 40 days, that journal became a manuscript, and that manuscript became a book, and that book is what brings me to talk here today to talk to you about the labyrinth as a spiritual practice for healing and resilience. Just in case you're wondering, the little boy running through the labyrinth in the photograph was our 3-year-old son, and he's 15 now. So time doesn't stop for anybody, I guess. But anyhow, that still leaves us with the question of why you should walk the labyrinth. And I would like to propose at least 3 reasons for why you should walk the labyrinth. The first is that our work in the world, especially the work of justice, can often pull us in many different directions. It can fray us, it can fragment us, and pull us in so many different directions that walking the labyrinth brings us literally, physically back to our center, to the center of who we are. And in this sense, walking the labyrinth can be like another spiritual practice called centering prayer, a kind of prayer that brings us back to the center of our being. And Pastor Jim or Pastor Kate could probably tell you a lot more about that. But the second reason for walking the labyrinth is that the work we are called to do in the world, whatever the work may be, because we live in a broken world, can often break our hearts and leave our souls feeling broken. And as the civil rights movement itself brought to us vividly, it can even sometimes break our bodies. And so walking the labyrinth brings us into a process of healing that leads to wholeness. I think one of the reasons it does this is because it doesn't have any prescribed formulas, it doesn't require any sort of special knowledge to make it work. You simply follow the path in the stillness of time and place, and it just has a way of bringing the fragments of our lives back together into a sense of wholeness. In my own experience, I found this would happen as I walked the labyrinth and just let my mind wander wherever it would go. And when I would get to the center of the labyrinth, I would stop, take slow, deep breaths, 3 or 4 slow, deep breaths, and just open myself to the present moment, to being aware of where I was, and then to walk my way back out. Third, the work that we are called to do in the world, the work that the prophet Micah called doing justice and loving mercy and walking humbly with God, can often wipe us out. It can often leave us drained of every ounce of energy and tired and to the bone. And so walking the labyrinth brings us back to our reason for being, to why it is we do what we do, whatever it is that we do. And this is how the labyrinth, I think, can be one of those practices that helps us, in the words of Dr. King, to transform our suffering into a creative force, to find again the fuel that fills us up, the energy that gives us what we need to be able to do the work that we are called to do. By bringing us back to our reason for being, the labyrinth connects with the Christian idea of baptism. And as a matter of fact, many of the medieval churches would put their baptismal font at the center of the labyrinth in their sanctuary to bring that point home. And many labyrinths are not in the shape of a circle, but in the shape of an 8-sided octagon to echo the 8-sided baptismal font. But I think the labyrinth also connects with the idea of Sabbath, this Jewish idea of the weekly rhythm of our lives that always brings us back to shalom, back to a sense of rest and renewal in the peace and the presence and the promise of God, in the presence of whatever is good and true and beautiful and holy in the world. But I think it can also connect with any religious conception of pilgrimage, like the El Camino de Santiago in Spain, or the Muslim idea of the Hajj to Mecca. any religious experience of pilgrimage, that sense of journeying in faith that culminates when its pilgrims reach whatever it is, whatever sacred place that is at the end of that path. The labyrinth connects to that similar experience of pilgrimage. But the beauty of the labyrinth is that you don't have to go anywhere to follow its way and to get to the end of the path, to its center. Your university, Valparaiso University, gives you 2 opportunities on its own campus to walk the labyrinth anytime you want. The first is the labyrinth that is at the end of the one end of the chapel, and I'm guessing you've probably walked past that labyrinth hundreds of times on your way to class. But the other one is a labyrinth that is at the Deaconess Center on LaPorte Avenue. Either of those labyrinths are available to you anytime you want, and I would encourage you to walk them, but I would also imagine it might be better to wait till the temperature outside is at least 2 digits to do that. But this session itself, our time here together today, is also meant to be interactive, to give you plenty of time and space here in this very room to experience the labyrinth for yourself. And you can do that in one of or any of 3 ways. The first is that there is a canvas labyrinth laid out on the floor in this very room. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that labyrinth is actually a replica of the labyrinth in Chartres Cathedral. And you can actually just walk that labyrinth in this time we have together today. More than one person can walk the labyrinth at one time. There's no rules or regulations about that. So I would invite you to just walk that labyrinth and let your mind wander and take those slow, deep breaths when you get to the center. And be aware of where you are in this one moment in time, and then to walk your way back out. Just be mindful of the neighbors around you as you're walking that path. The second is that you can trace your finger through one of the handheld labyrinths that are there in the room with you. There should be 1 or 2 of those handheld labyrinths, and you trace your finger along that labyrinth path as if you're walking the labyrinth. Let your mind wander, and when you get to the center, be still and take those slow, deep breaths, and then trace your finger back out. The third is that you can draw your own labyrinth. I've provided a handout that gives you the instructions for how you can draw a labyrinth on that paper right there, or wherever you want. Doesn't make any difference. But there should be a stack, plenty of copies of that handout available to you to draw the labyrinth yourself, and then do whatever you want with it. You can trace your way through or do whatever you want. So anyway, those 3 ways are available to you here now to experience your own walking of the labyrinth. And I'm very grateful that Pastor Kate and Pastor Jim are there with you in person to help guide you through that process. I also hope to be available via Zoom for any questions or conversations you would like to have during this time. I would enjoy that as well. I would like to close by reading a short passage from my book that I think in its own way echoes the words of Rabbi Heschel from the beginning. I felt my legs were praying in my own way. So from the book. When we think of prayer, we think of words, of a conversation. Indeed, prayer is this, but the labyrinth, as a discipline of prayer, is an act of prayer. In the labyrinth, I pray by taking each next step, 1 foot in front of the other. The labyrinth makes of prayer an act. It makes of action a prayer. In it, word and act are united, made one. When I was little, this is how I was taught to pray: to close my eyes, to bow my head, to fold my hands, then to speak into thin air. This much is true. This is a way to pray, and yet the labyrinth is a physical reminder, a sign, that prayer is also a place, a space in which life, new life, is lived. Prayer is not the thin air. Prayer is the world made out of thin air in word and action. And isn't that what prayer is, after all, the making one of time and space, speaking and action, walk and talk in the life of faith? After all is said and done, isn't prayer the uniting of one's life by listening to the voice of the one unseen? Oddly enough, this makes the labyrinth a place of solitude into a place of encounter. I walk the labyrinth in solitude, but I am never alone. The one unseen becomes the one seen in all creation. This becomes its paradox. The path of the labyrinth is a process of encounter. This is paradox because it is a solitary journey. Nevertheless, it is a journey to the center of things, to the center of life, to the center of my own identity, perhaps even into all reality. And in that singular encounter with the one who sits at the center of all life and of all reality, I walk into ever new discoveries of who I am and of how I am to live in the worlds that have been given to me: home, neighborhood, work, classroom, family, friends, ad infinitum. And I am transformed by the encounter. But how does the labyrinth, these thin circles on the floor, do all these things? More to the point, how can I walk the labyrinth as a path to all these discoveries? I know of only one way to answer the question, and the answer is even easier than it sounds: by taking the first step, and then taking it one step at a time. The labyrinth is a symbol of the living of life, one step at a time, one day at a time. The path of the labyrinth is the passage of life. Life is a labyrinth. The labyrinth is life. You know, when I was done writing the book, I had walked the labyrinth so many times I had to take a break. I just had to get away from it for a while. And so I didn't walk the labyrinth for a few years. And it wasn't until the year 2014. And if you were living in St. Louis in 2014, you would have known that it was a difficult time to be living in St. Louis. In August of 2014, the teenager Michael Brown was killed by a police officer in the suburb of St. Louis that the whole world now knows as Ferguson. And it was a difficult time, a very difficult time, to be about the work of justice and faith and love here in St. Louis and in a lot of other places throughout the world. It was then that I returned to the labyrinth, and I walked it again as a practice that brought me healing and resilience, as a way to bring me back to the center of who I am and who I am called to be in the world, in the work of justice and faith and love. Whatever has brought you to this place and whatever work you are called to do in it, in this broken world that can often break our hearts and our souls, and sometimes even our bodies, I pray the same grace and the same blessing to each and every one of you as you discover the labyrinth that is your life. Thank you again for the opportunity to be with you here today, and peace be with you all.